Right. Thank you so much. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk to you guys today. This is always my favorite subject. And I can't wait to hear your stories at the end of the presentation. But just to tell you a little bit about me, besides what you heard. So I grew up 5 blocks from my maternal grandparents, which was great because they were big on storytelling about ancestors. And so I grew up hearing about my ancestors. And so you can see here, my grandma very proudly showed off all the pictures of her grandchildren. And over here in the corner where I have this red circle, she had this stack of family photo albums that went back into the 1800s. So I grew up always having an interest in family history. And another thing about me, I've always loved writing. And interesting enough, when I was in 4th grade and I was asked what I wanted to do when I grew up, I said, I want to write a book about my ancestors. Not many 4th graders, I don't think, say that, but I did. And I grew up and did just that. But just to tell you a little bit, give you an overview of the presentation. So I'm going to talk about common genealogy experiences. I'm going to tell you how I listened to my ancestors, how to listen to your own ancestors, and then how you can work on developing your own intuitive genealogical abilities. All right, so I always like to start with common terms heard when doing genealogy, because a lot of times we hear these, but we really don't pay too much attention to them. So the first one is coincidence. And so according to Merriam-Webster, it says the occurrence of events that happen at the same time by accident, but seem to have some connection. So when we apply that to genealogy, this genealogist from California said, granted, I sometimes question if these events really happen, or perhaps it's coincidence. But when you experience multiple events over a period of time, it goes beyond coincidence. And I always like to say it's too coincidental to be coincidental. And then there's serendipity. We hear about that a lot too. So the occurrence and development of events by chance in a happy or beneficial way. And with genealogy, here's a quote that I found on Ancestry Insider that this person says, it's as though our ancestors want to be found. Uncanny coincidences, Olympian luck, phenomenal fate, tremendous intuition, remarkable miracles. We call it serendipity in genealogy. And then guidance, the act or practice of guiding, or the direction provided by a guide. And this genealogist from Wisconsin says, coincidences are what mainly come to mind when I asked her if she ever had any experiences like this. And she said they often seem guided. Like the time I was in Spooner, Wisconsin, and went to the post office to ask if they could help me find my still Bitney relatives. And the postmaster was a Bitney. And then intuition, the ability to understand something instinctively without the need for conscious reasoning. And for this, another post that said, I believe that our ancestors speak to us in ways we may not even know about. I believe we have intuitive senses about such things when we're near them. I honestly believe there is a psychic or some type of link, even between the ages. Perhaps it really is in our blood. And then chosen, having been selected as the best or most appropriate. And this person in this post says, I personally believe genealogists are chosen. Nobody in my family understands why I feel compelled to do this, and I can't explain why I can't just stop. I just wish more of these folks who have passed on wanted to be found. So sound familiar? How many of you have had experiences like this? And if you can just do like raise your hand, and we can just see if there's a bunch of you that have had that, because usually there's always people that have had something like that. But to tell you a little bit more about mine, so ready, willing, and able. So when I started doing genealogy in 2008, and I really got serious in 2009, it was as if the word went out to all of my ancestors. And not only was I ready and willing to able to do genealogy, they were right there with me, leading me, guiding me, serendipity, synchronicity, all of that to help me find them. And this is kind of what I felt like because I had so many bizarre experiences that I thought, how could this possibly be happening? And there were just so many things that I didn't even want to publicly admit things like that were happening, and just shared it with my sisters and my daughter because I thought people would think I was crazy. And then I went to Roots Tech for the first time in 2012. And as synchronicity and serendipity happened, I started overhearing all of these conversations from people that they were talking about similar experiences, and they were saying it out loud. They weren't hiding it. They were just matter of fact that, yes, I'm a genealogist and these things are happening and my ancestors are there to help guide me. And so they also brought to my attention these different books that were out there. So I, of course, bought all of them and read them and just absolutely love reading those type of stories that were very similar to mine. So my earliest remembrance of something like this when I was probably about 5 years old, and I was sitting on my living room floor just reading this book of poems and beautiful illustrated pictures. And I remember just feeling over to my left, I just felt like there was a presence or something there. And I just remember looking over there and just suddenly starting having all of these questions about my grandfather. So here's my grandfather here on the right and with his parents. So this is Dan Reilly Jr., Dan Reilly Sr., and Isabel McGregor. And my grandfather died before I was born. But at this time, I just had all of these questions. And so I decided to just go in, found my dad in the kitchen. And that was the first time I started asking questions about my ancestors. But I really felt like they were there next to me and just really wanting to be part of my life. And then in fifth grade, in social studies, my fifth grade teacher had a brilliant idea. So to make history come alive for social studies and geography, she had us all write down where our ancestors were from, what countries, and then she chose for each of us what country we would do a report on about that country, why our ancestors might have come over. She had us dress like our ancestors would have, and she had us bring a dish from the home country, and she invited all of our parents. And so it was a um, great day. And with my name being Megan Mary Margaret Reilly, I and everyone assumed I would be doing Ireland. But my teacher thought I was a little bit too prideful about my Irish heritage. And so she gave me Poland. And I remember looking at the list with that my mom wrote, and she said it was, Irish, German, Scottish, Polish. I just remember saying, "Mom, we're not Polish, we're German." And she said, "No, honey, we're Polish." And I kept on arguing with her, saying, "No, Mom, we're not Polish." But of course, my teacher chose Poland, so I had to do this whole presentation on Poland, even though I kept on telling my mom, "I know we're not Polish, we're German." And so years and years later, I started doing genealogy and I start researching that side of the family. So that was that you saw on the left, Maria Solma Newman. She lived to be 103 years old. And then her daughter, Josephine Newman Stigen, who lived till she was 97. But when I started researching this, what I found immediately was that they identified as Prussian and not Polish. So I had no idea back when I was in fifth grade anything about boundary changes, but they lived in a section of Prussia that became Poland, but they continue to identify as Prussian, as you can see in this census. So even though I had not a clue why I felt so strongly that the family was not Polish, but they were the German Prussian. Somehow in my DNA or my ancestors knew, and they wanted to make sure that I honored the correct heritage that they identified with. So those are a couple of examples, but how do we listen to ancestors? So for me, a lot of times, especially early on when I was doing genealogy, my ancestors came to me in dreams. And so one of the first experience I had involved my Reilly side of the family. So this is my second great grandfather, Lawrence Reilly. He was from Ireland, and he was married to Mary Downey. She died 2 weeks after the birth of their youngest child, Dennis. And then 2 months later, he married my second great grandmother, I'm sure, because he was terrified having three toddlers and a little baby and not knowing what to do with them. So, anyways, at the same time I started genealogy, I also took up Irish fiddle. And so I'd always wanted to do that. I was practicing doing both. And then year after I started both, I signed up for a fiddle camp. And so because I didn't want to embarrass myself, I put aside my genealogy and I practiced fiddle every chance I got. I'd come home from work and practice until my husband came home from work. So I had no time for genealogy. And then one night I had this dream that I was woken up by my second great grandfather's first wife, Mary Downey, and their daughter, Bridget. And they stood at the side of the bed, they shook me awake, and in their lovely Irish brogue said, "Stop fiddling around and get back to work. We want to be found." And apologize for my awful Irish accent, but I just found this hysterical that they would come into my dreams with this. And so I decided to listen to them and start researching. And at the time, um, I knew nothing about Bridget other than her name. I didn't know where she had lived, anything like that. But when I started researching, I came across this obituary for my second great granduncle who had died, and Bridget was his sister. And so it lists that she was from Greenfield, Indiana. And so with that, I was able to trace her family, connect with a third cousin. And here's Bridget on the left here with her children and their spouses and grandchildren. So, who knows how long it would have taken me to find Bridget without them waking me up like that and asking me to start working on them. And then another thing that you might feel, and if you do pay attention to this, is I had this feeling as if time was of the essence when I started researching Dennis Reilly. So he's the one his mom had died 2 weeks after he was born. He became a Catholic priest. And so as I was researching him, I knew from family oral history that he had gone to Canisius College in Buffalo, and then he wanted to seminary in Belgium at the American College in Louvain. So I knew that about him, but I had tried contacting the different places and tried to see if I could get more information. They didn't write back. But I suddenly just started feeling this almost sense of anxiety that I had to research him. And so I reached out to my brother, who is a Catholic permanent deacon who had worked for a bishop's office at the time, and asked him if he could help me, which I've never asked anybody to help me with my research like this before, but I just felt this need. And so what happened is the reason I was feeling the sense of urgency was because the American College of Louvain was closing and they were ready to destroy all of their records, which breaks my heart just thinking about it. But because my brother had contacted them at just the perfect timing before they destroyed the records, they sent him a huge folder of papers on Dennis Reilly. And so it listed his confirmation with his godparents, it listed his grades. There's a great story in here about how his parents did not want him to go to Belgium to become a priest, to go to seminary, because they wanted him to stay home and work and help take care of the family. And so in this letter, it talks about a bishop from Buffalo going to Niagara Falls to the house of my second great grandparents and convincing them to allow Dennis to become a priest and go to Belgium. But we never would have known any of that had I not paid attention to that feeling of urgency and acted on it. And then another time, so I had another dream where my dad came to me in my dream, and he just, again, sat at the end of my bed and just kind of shook me awake and said, "Don't forget that your grandfather kissed the Blarney Stone." And so I'd forgotten all about that family story of my grandfather kissing the Blarney Stone. That was why he had the gift of gab and was so funny and everything. But as an adult genealogist, I knew exactly what that meant. And so when I woke up, I started checking passenger records. And so I discovered a passenger record for my grandfather, then Daniel Reilly, and his father, Dan Reilly, that they had gone over to Ireland in 1905. And they sailed from Liverpool to Queenstown, which is now Cove in County Cork. But it struck me as really interesting because I'd always grown up hearing that our family was from County Cavan because Riley up there was like the name Smith. It was just very prevalent. And so I'd always always heard that we were from County Cavan. But this made no sense to me that they would have sailed into Queenstown. But I just felt it was really important that my dad was trying to tell me something about this. And so here again, I see them sailing back 2 months later from Liverpool. But again, if they're from Cavan, why would they not have sailed to Dublin, which was so much closer, instead of having to travel the whole entire country? So I just found that um, really odd and just really telling that I needed to pay attention to that. So when I started searching records, I had always been searching, never found anything for my family in County Cavan, and always put in the search that they were from County Cavan because is what I had been told. But after I saw that passenger record, I took out all the information about Cavan and just left it blank. And this record popped up. And so it was for Lawrence Ryle of Ballinasgreen, which is County Kerry. And I knew that my grandfather, Lawrence Riley's parents were John Riley and Margaret Griffin. But when I saw this, I just had this visceral reaction, even though logically I kept on telling myself, well, we're from Cavan, we're not from County Kerry. But I just had such a strong reaction to this record. I just felt it was really important to my family. So I just put it in my little virtual shoebox and kept researching. And then I found all these other records from the same area. So the marriage record of my third great grandparents, two more of their children, and since enough, of course, I found 10 others. So again, I just put it in my virtual shoebox because I still wasn't convinced that this gave me enough information to piece it together. Excuse me. So then in 2013, I did DNA. And so what pops up for my brother's white DNA was that his top message or matches here for the 37 markers were Ryle, two Riles, this other person who still have no idea how we're related. But these names were, again, the same as what I had found from County Cavan, or County Kerry, excuse me. So did more research, looked to see Kilmoyley, where the person was from, is right by Causeway. So I knew I was on to something, that those records, in doing more research here, finding all these other trees. I did DNA matches, did a little tree to connect the families that I found on the Y-DNA to my family. And again, more DNA shows that, yes, indeed, our family was from County Kerry and not from County Cavan. So again, pay attention to those reactions, because our bodies and our intuition know things that maybe our logical minds do not. All right. And so another dream that I had was my Scottish. And it seems to me definitely my Irish and Scottish ancestors just seem to be way more active in reaching out to me. I've had other experiences with the German lines, but definitely Irish and Scottish seem to be way more active. But so in this dream, so at the time, I just knew that my second great grandfather was Peter McGregor. I knew that he was the son of Gregor McGregor and Jane Davy. And so when my mom moved out of the house that she had lived in for 60 years into a senior living apartment, as family historian and genealogist, I got to take home all of the fun paperwork that she had in her possession. And so in this was this package that my dad had gotten then when his mom had died. And so it was all of the McGregor side of the family. And so excited. So, brought it home. My daughter and I put everything on the floor, looked through everything, trying to see if there was something that could give us more information on finding the McGregors. But it was just mundane things with my grandmother's things, and not anything that gave any indication as to the McGregor family. So again, in a dream, then I had Peter McGregor come to me in a dream and say, look again in that package and you'll find an important document stuck behind another paper. So I thought, well, that sounds really, specific. And so I woke up the next morning, went through all of those papers one by one, and sure enough, I found this piece of paper stuck, completely stuck, where I had to pry it up behind another paper. And it was my great grandmother's christening information, where it listed where she was born, her date of birth, where they lived 2 years later when she was being christened, and godparents, which includes this Charles McGregor. So I knew Charles must be a family member. And so I was so excited. So started researching. Could not find anything connecting Charles to Gregor and Peter. So I was really disappointed. I searched for months, couldn't find anything, was going to go on to the next family. And then Gregor came back into my dreams and said, go back and look again. And he was specifically telling me the 1851 Canadian census. And I argued with him saying, I've checked there, I'm sorry, I've looked it over several times, you're not there. And then he said, our name is misspelled, which is why you aren't finding us. Go back and look again. And so I did that, or I agreed to do that. And then immediately I was transported into this Scottish barn dance where my McGregors, McLeans, and McDonalds were all dancing. And because I knew that the McLeans and McDonalds were coming into this too, I also knew that they were in the background then waiting for their turn. But so I went to the 1851 census, started looking through, and in my search, I always did McGregor, and it just wasn't coming up. And you can see here that it's spelled capital M C lowercase g R I G E R. And for whatever reason, it was not coming up in the search engines. But when I went through methodically and page by page, I found this. And so it has Gregor, Jane, here's Charles, here's Peter, and then all these other siblings that I had no idea about. So I was just ecstatic on that. And then Jane came back, and in each of those dreams, I could sense Jane just kind of standing in the background, just waiting her turn. And so after I found that information, Jane and I had gone through and researched all the family or the children and stuff, got more information on them. And then when Jane came back, she asked me to look for her again with all of the new information I had. And so I did. And I was able to find her death certificate, which I had seen this before and put it in my virtual box. But at the time, I didn't have any definitive information linking this to Jane until I had all that other information, and I could see that she had a son, Alexander, who was a school teacher, which is exactly what I had found when I had researched. And so because of this, I was able to find that she was from Aberdeen, which I had no idea before. So that was just really exciting. So if your ancestors come to you in dreams, definitely listen to them because they want to be found. And then another way that you might start feeling and sensing your ancestors is just unexplainable hunches. So one morning I woke up and I just knew without a shadow of a doubt that I had to start looking through newspaper articles, and I knew I would find something on Peter McGregor's children, at least one of them, because at the time I knew that Janet McLean McGregor had given birth to 12 children, but I only found 8 that I knew what their names were at that time. And I had searched, couldn't find anything, but everyone was born and died between censuses, and so they weren't showing up. But on this day, I just knew I was going to find something, and so if you're familiar with Fulton History, which is a site from New York, it's very rudimentary, very not user friendly, but so worth it if you just plug away. And so on this day, I did that, and things hadn't been coming up in other search engines. But with this, I was able to find this whole story. It made headlines in every New York paper about this scandalous roadhouse tragedy where May was an 18-year-old who liked to party. And so she had gone to this roadhouse with a older man who was wealthy and had lived across the street from them. And they drank a lot. They they got a room upstairs, but they both died of carbon monoxide. And so it's a whole drawn out story of how it took about a day before the guy to be found and die. And then May was a couple days later that she survived. But I just knew, and sure enough, I just followed the hunch and I was able to find all this great information, great but sad information on May. And then another way that you might hear them, which you might not think about, but you will hear another way. But so I had discovered my Johnston family branches in 2017 and or 2016. And so I had not known anything about them, but was really excited to be able to go back a generation. And so when I went to Roots Tech in 2017, the first morning I woke up because I got there early so that I could research in the library. So when I woke up that morning, I just said to my ancestors, okay, ancestors, who should I start with today? And immediately I heard the Johnston family, of course, which I thought was hysterical. And so I decided to listen to them because I've discovered that if my ancestors are vocal, if they're in my mind in any way, I feel like they're pushing me, guiding me to find them. So I decided to research them. And so here's my maternal grandpa, and so he's a Johnston descendant. And so I was searching this transcription booklet that I had found in the library and going page by page. It was from Annan, Scotland, where the family was from. So going page by page, and you know how it is when you're researching, but you're not finding anything, and then you just start zoning out and you're going through the motions, but you're not paying attention. So that's what happened to me here. So I was going through this book when I got about halfway through, my mind just wasn't on it. And then all of a sudden I smelled my grandfather. So my grandpa had been a carpenter and he just had this, I mean, unique smell. It wasn't, smelly or anything like that. It was just him. And I always said, if I was anywhere and I had a blindfold, I would be able to pick out my grandfather. And so as I was reading, researching this book, and suddenly um, had that sense of smell, it brought me back into attention. And I looked around to see who it was that was walking by that smelled just like my grandpa, but there's nobody there. And so I enough of these things that happened that I thought to myself that something caught my attention for a reason. And so I decided to go back because I realized then that I had been completely zoned out, not paying attention. So I started going back page by page to see if there was anything I had missed. When I found this huge inscription, this is my fifth great grandfather, fifth great grandmother. It gives their names. I knew his name. I knew both of their names, but I knew he was a blacksmith in house. And so here it is giving his, when he died, how old he was, names of children, grandchildren, son-in-law. But had it not been for my my grandpa getting my attention with the smell that triggered me out of my zoning out, I never would have found this at that time. So pay attention to things like smell as well. And then looking for graves. And so I know a lot of people have these kind of experiences going to cemeteries, but this is my second great grandfather, Theodore Stigin. So um, he, as you can see, was a Civil War um, soldier. So he served in the band and he just looks like a baby there. He looks so young. But anyways, he our family affectionately called him the good spender because he inherited $2,500, which back in the 1800s was a lot of money, and still haven't figured out where it came from. That's still on my list of things to do. But after he um, moved the family, bought a house with a workshop for a wagon wheel shop underneath, and then he and his wife and 9 children lived on top. He proceeded to drink away all of the inheritance that he got, and he loved buying rounds for everybody in town at the local bar. So he went through the money within a few years. And so wagon wheel business started getting slow. So he decided to go to Oregon for some logging work. And unfortunately, he died in Oregon in a pauper's home, the poorhouse, um, of tuberculosis. And so I knew that he had been buried up there. And so my daughter lived in Portland and actually is back living in Portland. And so when I went to visit her, we spent a day going to the cemetery where he would have been buried to try to find him. And so my husband, my daughter, and I looked and looked and looked and couldn't find tombstone. But my daughter and I, every time we did a sweep, we would end up in the same area of the cemetery that for whatever reason we just kept on gravitating towards. And we did this about 3 times and couldn't find him. Gave up, went back. About a year later, I was looking through some of those papers that I brought from my mother's house, and I found that my grandfather had sent a letter to the cemetery requesting information about where his grandfather was buried. And what it said was that because he died in the poorhouse, they buried him in a pauper's grave, and it was in the same exact part of that cemetery where my daughter and I kept on gravitating towards. So without realizing it, we had found his grave. It just wasn't marked. Um, and then similar story for this is Michael Reilly. So he's Lawrence Riley's brother. And so I knew he had died in Tonawanda and went to the cemetery there with my daughter. And we found his sister's grave and her husband's, but could not find Michael. So, we searched and searched. And again, she and I always seemed to end up in this one particular place after we would do our sweep of the cemetery looking. And, we did a couple sweeps. So both times we ended back. And so couldn't find him. So we gave up. Following year, I was back in Buffalo. My mom and my sister had come along with me, so we went back to the cemetery, looked again, and same thing, looking through the cemetery, and for whatever reason, ended up in the same exact place whenever we would regroup to say that we couldn't find anything. But the second year, we saw this guy mowing the lawn. And so when we looked at him, he turned off his mower, came over and asked who we're looking for. And so I said, Michael Reilly. And he said, well, hey, I've got a plat map, in the shed over there. Let me go take a look and I can tell you where he's buried. And so we're like, great. And so we're standing there and he comes out and he's looking at his map and he kind of looks up at me kind of funny. He said, who did you say you're looking for? And I said, Michael Reilly. And he said, you're standing on his grave. So pay attention to those times where you're just drawn to a certain place, even if a grave isn't marked, because chances are you did find them and they helped you find them, but you might just not realize that that's where they're buried. And then here's just a couple more interesting things. So familiar places. There's a lot of people that feel like when they go to a place where their ancestors had lived, that they feel like it's familiar to them. So this person says, a few summers back when I was in Maine, we went to a town I'd never been to before, but as we drove into the quaint small town, I got the eeriest feeling I had been there before or that I knew this place. And I hear that a lot from people, that just a sense of familiarity. And then here's another person. She says, shortly after starting my family history, my late husband and I visited Scotland. At the time, all I knew that some of my ancestors once lived in Kirkcaldy. En route to Kirkcaldy, we drove through a quaint little town called Aberdour and decided to stop for a while and stretch our legs. The moment we started walking along one of the cobblestone streets, I had the very strong feeling of having been there before. A few minutes later, I told my husband that if we turned left at the next street, there'd be some old houses with beautiful gardens, and if we sat on the white bench in front of one of the houses, we'd catch a glimpse of the sea. My husband laughed and commented on my imagination, but led the way, turning left at the next street, where he stopped abruptly. The sight that greeted him was exactly as I described it. After returning home to Australia, I began working in earnest on the family history and was not at all surprised to learn that several generations of my family had actually lived in Aberdour. So strange things definitely happen. And then a lot of times there's coincidences in timing. And so with this picture, so on Ancestry, I had just virtually met a relative by marriage. And so it turns out that we only lived 20 minutes away from each other. And so I invited him to one of the Highlands Ranch Genealogical Society meetings. And so he came and he brought out this picture and he said, hey, can you take a look at this? Because one of my relatives is finishing up a book and family history, she wants to put this picture in, but she doesn't know anybody in the picture except for the people in the front row. So I took a look at the picture and probably screamed a little too loudly, but I'd never seen this picture before. But this is my great-grandmother, who's the fourth from the right, my great-grandfather, second from the right, and all the people in the back. I could identify every single one because they're all siblings and cousins of my great-grandparents. But it was perfect timing because the next week she was sending off the book with this picture in it, and so she was able to have all of the names instead of just an unidentified photo. And then here's another comment on coincidence and timing. And so this is another genealogist that I met through Ancestry. And she says, and she was also working on a family history book. And she said, we thought the Conrads brought us together. I still believe that. I also believe all these people wanted their stories told. Even as I was moving towards the end of my work, little snippets of information would emerge, as if someone was saying, don't forget to include this, or see, I did that. And then one of the most important things you can do is asking for help. So I went to Scotland in 2019 and I was working on my book at that time. And so I really wanted to finish my book before I went. So I just didn't have to worry about it. I could just celebrate. But as soon as I asked my ancestors saying, hey, listen, you guys are the ones wanting me to do this. So, I'm kind of drawing a blank here. Can you help me finish up my book? I got the strong sense that they didn't want me to finish the book before I went to Scotland, that something was going to happen in Scotland that would be a great addition for the book. So I completely trusted what they said and let me go back here. So went to this um, little tiny museum here in Annan and trying to see if there's any information. And it turns out that the volunteer working that day was a Johnston descendant. And so she and I were somehow distantly related. And so she said, "Hey, I get off my shift at 4 o'clock. I will take you around," because I was telling her when I started telling her who I was looking for, who I was related to there, and told her about Thomas Johnston, the blacksmith. She said, "I know exactly where he lives. Meet me at 4. I will take you there." And so here you can see it says the Smithy House. Um, and so she took me to the house, and the on the far end is where the family lived, and then you can see this is where my fifth great grandfather and for generations of Johnston blacksmiths did all of their smithy work. And you can see the ramp here where they brought the horses in to make horseshoes. So it was just really great. So had I not trusted in my ancestors and the feeling that something was going to happen, then that whole story would have been missed for that book. And because I also trusted that there was going to be something happened, I was on high alert the whole entire time, just watching for those coincidences and synchronicities. But your ancestors want to be found, but you don't only have to take my word for it. So just a couple of the stories that I have of other people's, because I've got about stories of 30 other people's stories in my book. And so these are just a couple of my very favorites. But this person says, "I wasn't looking for them, but they found me." So Tanya here used to, her still does go to antique shops, thrift stores, things like that, to buy things and then resell. And so when she was in a store one day, she found this whole big envelope of pictures. And so a whole bunch of pictures. It had the family's names on the back, and she recognized the name as people that had lived in her town but didn't know who they were. And so she thought she would buy the pictures and then just do a nice random act of kindness and find the people and give the pictures back. Well, 3 years later, the pictures were still sitting there, that she hadn't done it, but her daughter gave her a DNA test for Christmas. And as you know, that happens for a lot of people. She discovered that the father who raised her was not her biological father. But when she discovered who her biological father was, all of those pictures that she had found and bought were all of her ancestors. And so that's why she says that they found her. But I just think that's a fabulous story. And then here's another really cool story. So here's a woman from Australia who was driving through a town on the way to someplace else, and she saw this antique store and just felt this urge to stop and go into it. And so she had never gone into an antique store before, and she's just questioning herself what she was doing. But she parked, she went into the antique store, starts looking around and just thinks to herself, "What am I doing? I'm just wasting time." And so she started to turn around to go back to her car when she just felt this strong, strong, strong urge to go through the store into a back room. And so she did. She looked up on the wall and she spies this picture of her second great grandfather on the wall, the original. She had seen a copy of it before, but the original was there in the wall. So had she not listened to that urge to stop at that store, she never would have found that original picture of her second great grandfather. Um, but so ways that you can develop your intuitive genealogical abilities is become more aware of the thoughts of ancestors who pop into your head. So pay attention to them, because a lot of times when they pop into your head, they're there and they're wanting you to find them. They're wanting more information about them to be found. Um, Pay attention to dreams, definitely. Pay attention to any ancestors lingering in your thoughts. So it's one thing if they just kind of pop in, but if your ancestors or just seem to be lingering in your thoughts, they're really, really wanting to be found, and can oftentimes help guide you to find the right information or the right circumstances to find the right records. And then pay attention to those visceral sensations that I talked about, um, with when you see records and things like that. If it doesn't make sense, just like I did, put it into a virtual shoebox so that you can come back to it. And so here's um, another example of a visceral reaction for me. So again, like I said, had grown up hearing that we're from County Cavan, but when my sisters and I went to Ireland and we toured all around, we went to County Cavan and we're like, oh yeah, that was nice. We went to where our ancestors were from, but didn't really feel this huge connection. But we went to County Kerry and just absolutely loved it. And this particular afternoon was just very memorable for me because we were in this restaurant. We decided to pull over, get some tea, and had some great banoffee pie there, and we're just looking out the window, and we could have stayed there for hours, and we just felt so comfortable, and we said, gosh, I could live here. I could just stay here forever. Well, it turns out, what we're looking out at the window here, you can see this peninsula. That's where some of my ancestors were from. So we were having this wonderful feeling of sense of home without realizing it. But our body's reactions were telling us something that our minds didn't know. And then, like, pay attention to coincidences, serendipity, synchronicities. Pay attention to intuition, any kind of hunches that you have, or that sense of knowing without knowing why. Pay attention to all of your senses, your hearing, feeling, seeing, tasting, and smelling. So I've had this happen several times to me where suddenly I'll just taste my grandma's homemade chocolate chip cookies, or her chicken, or smell these different scents, and you just know that your loved ones, your ancestors, are near. And sometimes when you might smell this, it's not necessarily that they're there to help you find them in records or anything, but they're just letting you know that they're close by. And most importantly, always ask for your ancestors' help. So just a sneak peek of volume 2, because I had so many more experiences happen since I published my first book, and so many people have come forward and said, oh, I've got this great story to share with you, that I'm working on volume 2. And just to give you a couple things, so asking for signs, again, is very important. So these are my McLean's and McDonald's, if you remember, that I had said that I knew that they were waiting their turn. So I had been researching then, hadn't found anything. So I wrote to this friend after researching for several months, and I wrote to her and said, I haven't made any breakthroughs lately. I've been plugging away relentlessly on my McLean and McDonald Scottish sides from Tyree, Scotland. I'm ready to move on to another branch, hoping that my Scots will throw me a huge sign to keep me on the trail. And so I've got all of these coincidences, synchronicities, everything that transpired during this very short time, like almost immediately after I wrote that, to be able to trace back to my 22nd great-grandfather, after only having known at that time my third great-grandfather on the Scottish side. And then here's another person that will be his story. He's got several stories in the book. So it looks like I'm finally going to locate the Kings. I was in touch with the Bunyan historian. Turns out he went to school with the Kings. Small world. And then I just actually got back from Ireland last week, where I spent 3 weeks. So before I left, I belonged to this Ever Peninsula DNA page. And so I just put up a post just saying that I was going to be taking public transportation and could people recommend a bus to help me access Southern Cary. And so remember, I asked for a bus, public transportation, and all of these people starred, I mean, multiple people said, Teddy Kennedy is your man. I also recommend Ted Kennedy as a local expert anywhere in County Cavan or County Kerry, especially the area of Ring of Kerry. He's very knowledgeable. And then this other person, make contact with Ted. He'll advise you. This other person, Ted Kennedy, is great. So all of that got my attention. Number one, because again, I only asked for public transportation, and all these people are giving me information about contacting this person. And this person I knew was a DNA match of mine. So I knew I was being led and guided to make contact with Ted. And so here's Ted. So he came and Killarney, he picked me up, drove me all around the Ever Peninsula and took me here. This is where possible, because we're still not exactly sure, but we know it's from my Donahoe side, as they pronounce it. But here's where his Donahoe ancestors had lived. And then here's another one. So this is Potty Murphy. I also met him just a few weeks ago. And so again, he's from the Donohue side of the family. And he also said that it just seemed like coincidence and serendipities that suddenly people that he had been asking for a long time to test, suddenly right around the time I went to Ireland, started contacting him, and their tests came online and things like that. So definitely all of these kind of these connections and coincidences are going to be part of my book, but pay attention to those kind of things as well for yourself. So I'm going to stop sharing the screen, see if you guys have any questions or if you want to share any experiences of your own. And if you are interested in being in my next book, and if you have some stories that you think would be great for that, please feel free to contact me. I would love to hear them. But let me get off of stop share.
Super interesting, and there's been great conversation happening in the chat that I've enjoyed watching. Funny that you brought up that peninsula. That is the tiny, tiny, tiny little place that my husband's, like, my father-in-law, their people are from there according to DNA, but I haven't been able to find the connection yet. So weird coincidence.
Probably related to him.
I was discussing that today. Oh God, that's funny. So there are a couple questions in here, and I see that there's also conversation in the chat about the same subject, but somebody was asking if you feel that ancestor memories can be passed down through DNA, like scientifically.
I do. I do really believe that, because I think there's so many people that have things and not know. So another story in my book is about a person who she grew up, never knew her father, but she always had this love of the blue and white Delft pottery from the Netherlands. And she always had this love of photography. Well, turns out when she became an adult and tracked down her father was a photographer, and his ancestors lived right across the street from the Delft pottery company or whatever in the Netherlands. So things like that, you just keep on hearing things like that are just, like I say, too coincidental to be coincidental. So I do believe that they can be passed down.
I know that there have also been studies done on how traumatic events for specific groups of people, like the Holocaust, for example, or I know I read another one that talked about the descendants of Irish people who would have survived the famine and how that can be passed down. I had shared the link to one of those studies in the chat. There's also a book on the subject that talks a little bit about that subject for Ireland called Saints, Scholars, and Schizophrenics. And it's about mental illness in the West,
Mhm.
in Ireland, and it does touch on that a little bit. But yeah, so I see some people talking about that in the chat too. And they're also they love all the stories that you shared.
Good.
Yeah, yeah.
And I
Okay.
think stories like that are so much fun.
Oh yeah, for sure. So the next question, what DNA testing company was the one that you had shown on during your presentation?
Um, so the first one was the Y-DNA, so that was family tree DNA.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and then the other ones were Ancestry.
Somebody's asking what the name of that book was. I'll put a link to it in the chat.
Okay, thanks.
I dreamed an entire life of a woman named Jane. Came as a new bride, lived her life in a Chicago hotel with her husband, immigrated at 17 years old to America. Her last name was Passion. I dreamed I was her. What do you think? Felt disappointment in her husband. I don't know why.
Hmm. Have you tried researching to see if you can find her information in her stories? Because there's a similar book. I'm trying to think what the name. There was a movie too that Jane Seymour had portrayed the woman, but same thing. She kept on dreaming all these things, and then turned out that it was all absolutely had happened.
Yeah.
But the Jenny, something with Jenny, something like that. But if you research Jane Seymour's movies, you should be able to find it. That's really interesting, though.
Yeah. She says that she tried researching the lady, but hasn't really found anything.
Hmm. Hmm.
Come back to it
Hmm.
in a couple of years.
Yeah, yeah, because
Yeah.
there's always new records coming on and things like that that you might be able to find something.
Do you have a book by the bedside and write down dreams, or how do you handle it so that you remember them? That's a good question.
That is a good question. So I always say there's a difference between dreams and visitations. And so these dreams, the dream visitations where your ancestors come in are so vivid that you remember them. And so it's different than a dream where a lot of times you wake up from a dream and you can't remember what it was. But these visitations, I mean, even years and years later, I can still so vividly remember everything in there. So if it is a visitation like that, you will remember. But I would definitely recommend keeping a journal by your book or by your bedside, or if you have Alexa, which I don't want to say it because she'll pop on, but I know somebody that has one by her bedside, and so she'll just say, you know, Alexa or SIRI.
Alexa, for those
Yeah,
who
yeah,
aren't picking that up.
yeah. Remind me to remind me of this, and so it will record what you say that you can write it down the next morning. So I thought that was really good because if you don't want to get up and write, you can do that.
Yeah, my husband went through a phase where he was having these like incredibly vivid nightmares, and I had told him, and he couldn't quite remember all the details, but that like not like later on when he would go back to sleep and then wake up later. So he would pull out his phone and make a voice memo on his phone,
Mhm.
which could also wake you up. So maybe don't do that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, that's interesting. Okay, so somebody said in the chat, a bit off topic, but I had a white light experience during surgery. Had a fantastic conversation with my grandma. I can recall every word of our chat.
Hmm.
That's
That's
wild.
cool.
A few years
I
ago,
have, yeah, I have read incidences about that too. So,
yeah, a few years ago, my sister, she had this vivid dream that she had thought was induced by medication. Entirely could and totally could have been, but it was about my step grandmother, and it was so lifelike. She's like, I could feel her touch my face, and then I woke up
mhm,
and I was just sobbing because she had passed away a few
mhm,
years before that. But it
mhm,
was
mhm,
intense enough to where she was telling me about it a few years later, and she was
mhm,
still like uncomfortable by the entire
mhm,
situation.
mhm.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Some people sharing some more stuff about near death experiences and people they knew who were patients who had those vivid memory type events. It's very cool. It's a super
Mhm.
interesting topic.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I know. Like I said, I always love when it happens to me. I love hearing other people's stories and yep. Is there a
Yeah.
way to I'm just trying to see if there's a way to save the chat.
I'm glad you
Um,
brought that up. For everybody who wants the chat, send us an email. Megan, I'll send you an email. But
thank you.
everybody else, send us an email if you'd like a copy of the chat. It is genealogy@acpl.info, and we will get that out to you. Yeah, great. Well, thank you all again for joining us, and thank you, Megan, for such a great
Well,
presentation.
thanks for asking me. I
Yeah,
appreciate it.
great. Well, I might actually send you an email about Ted Kennedy later.
Yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely.
yeah,
Oh, he's great. He's absolutely great.
that's awesome. All right. Well, enjoy the rest of your day, everybody. Thanks.
Yeah,
Bye.
thanks everyone. Thanks for joining in.